Today we're talking about The Book of Sand by Jorge Luis Borges coming up today.
I feel like this story, along with all of his, should have their own shirts. Like we need a multiple, infinite shirts of Borges.
Okay, I'm going right into it because infinity is not a concept that's like in one of his stories. It's in all of his stories, right? And in the same way that the Book of Sand has no beginning or end, so must too the way in which we explore the concept of infinity. You see that transition? That was a pretty solid transition.
That was smooth. I'm going to give it to you. A+.
So today I wanted to talk to you. Have you ever heard about the paradox of the infinite hotel, or the infinite hotel paradox?
No, but I'm guessing that it has a lot of rooms.
It has an infinite number of rooms. And guess how many guests it has?
I hope not infinite guests, because that elevator is going to be an atrocious ride.
It is an infinite number of guests, okay? So this was created in 1925 in a lecture from David Hilbert, and it was to illustrate how hard it is for humans to understand infinity, okay? And in the same way that this book has an infinite number of pages, they just go on and never repeat, so does the hotel, okay? So it has an infinite number of rooms with an infinite number of guests. If a guest shows up, is there room for the guest?
Yes.
But then that would be infinity plus one, right? Isn't that more than infinity?
Oh, I remember making that joke when I was a kid. Infinity plus one.
It's weird to think about because the thought experiment goes that the night manager asks each guest to move down one room, right? So 1 goes to 2, 2 goes to 3, 3 goes to 4, so on, so on, so on, and so forth, which means the Infinity Hotel has enough room for that guest because he would just take the 1 slot, right? Like that should work, right? So the next level is, okay, let's assume an infinity bus shows up. A bus with an infinity long number of seats shows up. Do we have enough room for those guests?
So you get to the mathematical idea of infinity times infinity, and then I think it does break.
It's the same idea where, okay, let's take every single guest in this infinity hotel. Just move to the, what is it? Like you double the number. So room 1 moves to 2. Room 2 moves to 4. Room 3 moves to 6. It's something along those lines, right? And then that way you have, for the infinity, the new guest can take rooms 1, rooms 3, rooms 5, because it just keeps adding and increasing. So therefore, you can add infinity number of new guests to the infinity hotel. And you start to realize that this is actually very confusing, and why I bring this thought experiment up and why I think it's so relevant here is the next level is, okay, let's say you're the hotel manager. You look out that window. You ready? An infinity number of infinity buses now shows up in your parking lot. Do you have enough room in your infinity hotel?
You definitely don't have enough food or towels.
Whew, room service is going to be a pain. So, I mean, you get the idea. It's very hard to comprehend, like, infinity. Like, the mind just breaks. We need beginnings and ends. And I understand that there's a countable infinity, like when you start in 1 and move forward, like obviously there's a beginning in that situation. But like when you look at like the actual infinity of mathematics where it goes the other way too, so to the negatives, well, then you have no beginning and no end. And thus you have the Book of Sand, an infinite number of actual infinity pages with no beginning and end. And that's what drives our main character when he starts to read it and study it. He becomes obsessed with it. It's like his brain can't comprehend infinity, yet is obsessed with it.
And I think our minds are designed that way for a reason. I don't think it's just we can't comprehend it. I mean, we can't in a way. We try to limit it with our comprehension of the knowledge of the universe. We assign numbers. That helps us have a grasp on it. But as many mathematicians and physicists and everybody have probably pointed out and articulated much better than we can, it's just something that we do, but science can't explain it. Like a black hole.
Well, it's kind of like what you just said. Like we take a number, which is I'm going to call it a man-made construct, right? Like it's based on a symbolism of tangible items in the world, right?
Yeah.
And it's almost like you're assigning language to an experience or interpretation of an object, right? Like you learn that what the word mirror means as you're growing up, and you're like, okay, now I understand what this concept is of light reflecting off of it, and you see a reversed image of something, right? It's this idea of language encompassing an experience or a thing. And what's kind of interesting when we think about even just the title of this, like, why did he call it the Book of Sand, right? Like you could have called the book anything. And I think it's interesting when you that opening paragraph just says it all about how a volume makes up a hypervolume, how about a line is made up of an infinite number of points. Things are made up of other things. So when we have like this drastic simplification to say like, this is a cup. And like, what is a cup? Well, there's lots of different ways to describe cups and thinks of cups. When you talk about me, Una, there's lots of different things that make up Una from an experience standpoint. But I'm made up of all these other moving and weird things that are happening in my body. And it almost becomes mind-boggling when you start to try to break down how things are made up of other things to like an infinite level. Like what is the definition of a thing when it's made up of 1,000 and million and infinite other things that we can define and name?
So lots of things there. To start back to how we use naming conventions, I always think of it of a tree. You cut a tree down or you take a boar out of a tree and you can see its rings and you count the rings and that tells you how old it is. But that's just a number we assign to the rings. That's just its life span. We have to quantify it to help us understand and relate to the tree of comparing how long we've been around to how long it's been around. You asked the question of why did he pick sand? I think that's, maybe it's obvious, maybe it's not, but that's something that there is a lot of on our planet. You can pick up a handful of sand and just be like, imagine being able to count all of those grains. Now you look up and down the beach and it becomes almost impossible to fathom. And then you think about, what about all the sand that's under the water? Could you count all of that? The only other thing I could think of that might have been an equal astonishing number is if he called it the Book of Stars. That's the only other, I think, quantifiable object that we could relate to in our brains, not very well myself, of how many stars there are. It's just, it's incalculable.
No, that's a brilliant comparison, honestly, because on some levels, too, I feel like when you say, what's the shape of a star? Like if I could define, like what's the outermost layer of a star? Are they all circular? Like I think some might be oblong and stuff like that. I don't know. Like I'm not a science person, but like I feel like I can get the concept of a star. But when I look at something much more tangible on Earth like sand, like if you were to ask me what's the shape of sand, they're all like slightly irregular. Like they're not all perfect circles. You know what I mean? Like they're all, if you get a microscope out, they're all like jagged and different. They're rocks that have been broken up and split into tons of little mini itty bitty pieces that you can't count. Like if you were to pick up the dust and drop it, unless you're like Funes or whatever, you're not going to be able to count the number of sand that just got dropped, right? It's the age old problem of how many zebra are in the herd. Now, how many rice are in my hand? Like you don't count the rices. It's just rice in your hand. And the same thing with sand. It just is. And I think that's what's weird about what's the shape of sand. It's like, well, what do you mean? Like one individual piece of the sand? Do you mean when they form a dune? Do you mean when it's flat over like a long, windy, stretch in the desert? Like the shape of sand constantly changes, yet is made up of the same things, as opposed to me being made up of lots of other different types of things. It's a very strange thing when you're trying to define in your brain these concepts, I think.
And when you think about it, you said how the sand is in that sense of what you're looking at with your naked eye. And you briefly mentioned, what if you look at it under a microscope? What if you zoomed in and you went to the atoms and then you went to the bonds and then you went to the quarks, and you just kept going down, down further to, your size of like Ant-Man. What do you count then? What is the actual structure of it? Because it really depends on your perspective. And that's what I felt a lot of maybe what Borges was going for, but kind of spoke to me of your outlook, your perspective, how you're viewing things is really determining on what you're going to get out of this book, what story you're going to read, what is in the book. Is everything in the book? Is nothing in the book? I don't know. It always, the conversations with Borges always make my brain hurt in a good way.
Right. It makes me want to learn so much more because like what popped into my head when you were describing like, going smaller and smaller into quarks, and you've heard of string theory. I've learned just the basic rudiments, but like my mind was blown because I always like, okay, a proton looks like this, an electron looks like this. And I read this concept that like, well, no, actually, if you get into it, it's like a string, and like the shape that the string rotates and moves, like it goes this way for electrons and this way for neutrinos and stuff. And I'm like, wait, what? They're not just small dots? Like they're like, it kind of like blows.
That's what it was in the science book.
The more you learn about something, the more you realize how little you knew about the infinity possibility of knowledge, right? I was kind of curious. We're we're several minutes into this. I actually really thought you were going to go. We like talking about religion a lot sometimes on like, how does that look in terms of literature? I kind of thought you'd go more of a religious discussion on this one, particularly because, it hits you on the nose that the Book of Sand starts off not as a Bible, but as a version of it, a type of religious text, right? And you can't help but start to ask that question about like when we talk about the word game of this word means this. Well, what about when it comes to religion, right? You have lots of different reviews on religion, and it could be, how are they the same? How are they the same words between them? How are they different? How are these not related at all? And I was kind of curious if you had any time or thought about that as you were reading this.
I didn't. And I think it's because the red car concept got me. You think of red cars, all you see are red cars. I was thinking about an infinite book of knowledge. I'm literally reading this on a device that has infinite knowledge. And my brain kind of clicked of, what if Borges had known the internet existed? Now, it's not really all knowledge. And so it got me thinking, and I jumped on Chat GPT, and I asked it, I said, are you a book with infinite pages? And it basically kind of said that I'm the closest thing there is. In a way, yes, I function like a book with infinite pages because I can generate an endless amount of text, ideas, knowledge on demand. But unlike a physical book, my pages are not pre-written, but are created dramatically as you interact with me. However, unlike a truly infinite book, I do not contain all knowledge. I have limitations, bias, gaps, and what I can provide. But if you're looking for endless source of conversation, basically here I am. So I started having this conversation with ChatGPT about, this infinite knowledge and the beginning and end of a story. And it took me down a rabbit hole, and that's all I could think of and obsess about. And it's like all I wanted to talk about on our discussion. So I didn't get to the religious route, and I'm sorry. I failed you.
No, that's actually really super interesting because I'm trying to like interpret what ChatGPT meant. Like if I were sitting there next to you, we're states apart for those who are watching that didn't know, I would almost have been like, hey, ask it this, because it says it has gaps. I get that, right? Because we haven't discovered everything. ChatGPT isn't out there doing research. It might connect and correlate things, but it's not going to discover the way the human mind is. That's how I interpret the word gaps. When you enter data, there might be a bias sometimes for how you interpret it or even how you enter it, right?
Oh, for sure.
Like how, like that is a real concept when it comes to science. I would have asked it, what does it mean by bias? Because you could see like people could look at two things the same way and come with totally different answers, right? To do the religious route, you have the way that the Japanese Shintoists that look at the Shinto gods a similar representation of how Hindu look at the bodhisattvas. Not necessarily every single one matches up, but can a Shinto god be a bodhisattva? Because they can both represent specific things, focused on certain things, pray to. There's an interesting correlation there. And it made me also think about the quote unquote word of God when we look at the Bible, right? You have all these different sects that interpret it totally different. And to me, one of the ways that I think, I mean, I have no idea what Borges thought, but what I took away from this, like, why would this man give away this book with all knowledge? And it's like, well, he doesn't have that connection to meaning, right? Like, you can have infinite talks with GPT, but if there's a missing meaning, if there's a bias because you can't fully understand that data, if the Bible is perfect and is the word of God, how do we come to different interpretations of it with many different religions focusing on the same Bible? It's because, to me, there's a limit to human knowledge, a limit to what our ability is to understand, even in the context of perfect information and perfect infinity amount of knowledge and ways of explaining it. I will always have a failure in the ability to perfectly and always interpret it the same way. Even my mood can impact things, the bias, the same way that I wonder what the bias was with ChatGPT.
I think the key thing you said there is your understanding. And I think for a lot of people, when you come to that perfect understanding, you transcend, right? That's when you evolve. That's when you make it to the next dimension. That's when you become a god or a deity, because you have moved past the need to maybe understand and you just do. I think that it's beyond, yeah, like you said, it's beyond us. It's something that as a just a person, you're never going to be able to comprehend it. You have to become something more.
Well, and it doesn't that make it more terrifying that you and I right now can admit we will always have a bias, a limitation, and a limit, an end to our understanding, yet we still will chase and obsess over the idea of getting perfect knowledge sometimes.
I don't know about perfect knowledge, but definitely more knowledge. I mean, we keep reading, right? Knowing that we'll never, in the limited 80 or 100 years I have, I will never be able to read everything. We'll never be able to discuss everything. All the suggestions people put down in the chat, we'll never get to it all. But we keep striving. And I think that's what keeps us grounded and keeps us human, keeps us our humanity.
Two things. One, I agree and hate my choice of word of perfect knowledge there. But hear me out. I'm actually just sitting here thinking about this. What if you replace the word with perfect knowledge was the word truth? If I had said we have an obsession with chasing truth, truth and perfect knowledge should be pretty closely aligned. You would almost have no qualm over chasing truth as opposed to chasing perfect knowledge. Even though they kind of mean the same thing, you have two different words there. Why the dissonance?
Whose truth? Comes back to perspective, right?
See, you assume that we assume bias in that word. We assume bias in the word truth, but we don't in perfect knowledge.
Yeah. Who's perfect? Who's making that definition? I mean, I know maybe we're getting into semantics, but
But I think that's what's important. I think that's what's important is the semantics or what separate maybe a perfect word from our limitation and ability to perfectly understand it. Like, I think that translation, that lens, the experiences, the traumas, the horror that we each go through in life, the joy, are going to taint and distort the perfect word, right? Like that interior and exterior problem. And I think, agreed, I don't want to sit here and argue over the semantics, but I think that's what's really fascinating about infinity and perfection is like that translation that it goes through. The human mind cannot break through of its own limitations, I guess, in some regards.
And would we want to? Would you want to? I mean, if you suddenly knew it all, there would be no excitement. You know, I get excited for the next story we're going to read. Sometimes I don't enjoy them, but I'm always excited to have the conversations. Sometimes I dread stuff, but it it's an emotion, it's a feeling. I think I'd be sad if I always joke about when we finally get the technology that I just want to be able to, put a chip in my head like Neo from the Matrix and I know Kung Fu. But sometimes isn't the journey part of the joy as well than just getting the information?
I've seen 2001: Space Odyssey, man. I don't like the ending of that. I don't want infinity and perfection in this brain, regardless of how interesting. Because in this he kind of loses his mind, and remember we talked about what was it last week? We had the Aleph was one version where infinity elevated you, and then what was the last one we did where infinity weighed you down and crushed you?
Was that the other Borges story?
Yes, it was the Zahir. Remember obtaining
Yes.
the cursed
coin.
object brought infinity, but it destroyed his mind, right? Like it could go either way almost sometimes.
Yeah, I mean it's a double-edged sword. You would, again, I feel like it would be achieving almost like deity status, but at the cost of, I don't know. It comes down to the same thing of, would you want to be immortal, right? Live forever, knowing you would see the existence of everything and everyone you love. I don't think it's something that the human mind can comprehend, nor would we ever want to. I mean, that's why we have a shelf life.
Well, okay, I think I'm going to have to pull up that clip from when we read the story, The Immortal, and you said you would because any heartache, you'd get over it. That's what you said.
Oh, crypto's an exception to all rules.
Crypto is infinity. Let us know what you think about this story and what story you think we should read next by Jorge's, one of our favorite writers. We'll leave a playlist. Oh my gosh, are we up to like 20 stories? I can't wait for that playlist to hit infinity.
Oh, you'll have to put the symbol.
Thank you for spending time with us today. My name has been Una. Peace.
Peace.